Welcome to a Wednesday with Clear Mountain. We're joined today by Dr. Marjorie Woollacott. Marjorie, it's so good to have you.
It's great to
So an introduction to Marjorie. Marjorie Woollacott, PhD, is an emeritus professor of human physiology at the University of Oregon and a member of the Institute of Neuroscience. She has served as the chair of the Human Physiology Department and has taught courses on neuroscience, rehabilitation, complementary medicine, and meditation. Woollacott is the research director for the International Association of Near-Death Studies, IANS, and president of the Academy for the Advancement of Post-Materialist Sciences, AAPS. She graduated magna cum laude from the University of Southern California, earning her PhD in neuroscience, and holds an MA in Asian Studies from the University of Oregon. Woollacott has published over 200 scientific articles and 8 books, including the award-winning Infinite Awareness in 2015, which explores the spiritual power of the mind. And this is our second interview with Marjorie. We were delighted to have her on the first time, and Steve Wilhelm connected us. And today we actually are going to be diving in, among other things, to recent research Marjorie's been doing into telepathy in non-speaking autistic children. Am I getting that right, Marjorie?
Right, thank you.
Okay, and end-of-life lucidity as well. So before we begin into all that, Marjorie, first it just was wonderful having you on, I think it was a year ago at this point.
Yes.
And just thank you for joining again. Would you just sort of tell us about your journey from being a professor at the University of Oregon to being the scientific director of International Association of Near-Death Studies? What kind of catalyzed that shift in view and profession or orientation?
Sure. So I was definitely a materialist neuroscientist when I was a young professor, partly because going to graduate school, going to university and graduate school, you are always taught that the brain is truly the sole producer of consciousness. And every single professor, every single course always emphasizes that. And it sounded logical at the time. But then a few years later, when I was 30 years old, I had a meditative awakening when I was at a spiritual retreat that my sister gave me. I was a skeptical neuroscientist, but I was curious. And so when she invited me to go to this retreat with an Indian Swami, I accepted. And then in the first meditation session, we received this initiation in which I felt this energy go from his fingers right between my eyes on the bridge of my nose down into the center of my chest. And then I began feeling this electricity landing in my heart and then beginning to like radiate outward from my heart through my body and beyond. And it was a feeling that I'm home, my heart is my home, that I'd never felt before. It was like, oh, this is my home. I didn't understand. And that was accompanied by this feeling of joy, love, really a blissful feeling of interconnection with other people around me. And so I went home from that retreat and thought, what on earth happened to me? And then it slowly unfolded from there is all I can say. So that during my early career at the University of Oregon, I would be giving talks to my students on neuroscience during the day, and at home I had a meditation center at night, and I would meditate every morning at like 3:30 or 4 in the morning before I went into school. So that then headed me in that direction, and finally I realized that I was frustrated by only doing rehabilitation medicine at the university, started doing some research on meditation itself, and then started teaching a course in complementary medicine to my students to say, hey, there's more than just the brain. We can look at these other forms of healing. Did that for the last 11 years and then said, it's time to retire so I can move full time into doing this research. And that's when I then wrote that book that you were telling me about and was asked to be the director of research at IANS when I gave my first talk at a conference there in 2016. So that's the story.
All right. It's a great potted bio. In one of your papers, I've read you talking about the eye-rolling barometer, basically like the threshold with which some people, or any of us, just start rolling our eyes. I like to think of it as like the skeptic's flinch. It's like this philosophical othering where it happens a lot with my family. So I'm a Buddhist monk, and you know, both my parents are doctors and have a very materialist-oriented family. And when I mention certain subjects, it's like there's a trigger and almost see like the window of openness just close, and like it's closed for the next who knows how many hours or days. But how would you, so already we've mentioned some things which might be triggering to some people, might start people's eyes start beginning to roll. So is there any way that you found that to prime people to not eye roll, to be open to the things that we're going to be talking about tonight?
I think the word that I always use is curiosity. And I use that because I realized that I didn't have curiosity before I had that first meditative awakening. And so there was literature that was out there in PubMed, which is our typical United States medical database on near-death experiences. And I just didn't know about them because I wouldn't even type in the word near-death experience because I knew it couldn't be possible. So I think the key is that when somebody mentions a word like near-death experience or spiritual awakening, if we can put aside our skepticism for the moment and be curious to see what they have to say and ask them, well, what was your experience? And do you think there's scientific evidence? It's sort of like having that image in one's mind rather than, as you say, sort of like the veil going down over the eyes. And it's like, don't touch this because it can't be true. And I want to say that what I'm learning now about myself before I had that awakening and others that I talk to now is that there is a fear factor that's involved with the person that has a closed mind. And it's like they believe that their materialist worldview is the only worldview. And there's a fear that if you convince them that this wasn't the worldview, they would be now also isolated from the rest of the academic community because they now would be on the outside. And I think that is a frightening thing for a lot of university scientists and other people.
Mm-hmm. Why, we'll be talking about a few things beyond the near-death experience research, which we touched on the first session. But most of it has to do with sort of the primacy of consciousness or this post-materialist science. Why is this irrelevant? Why is this important?
I'm laughing, obviously, because to me, it's the most important thing in the world. And the reason I say that is because just looking at my own worldview, when I was a materialist scientist, I was separate from the rest of the world. And the most important thing to me seemed to be as a separate individual to try to make sure that this individual succeeded. And other individuals were not so important. And I thought animals were like little robots. That's the materialist worldview about an animal brain. A horse brain is only the size of a walnut. Well, it can't have anything in it then, is the way a neuroscientist might think. And so when you shift to the post-materialist worldview that consciousness is fundamental, it's in everything, and it's not the brain that's producing it. That horse has a consciousness that's far beyond what's in his brain. The same thing with my cats, with the trees around us. You shift to this whole very magical, mystical, miraculous world that you live in. And you realize that if you're interconnected, there's a way to communicate with everything else around you. And suddenly the world becomes alive. And you suddenly care about all the plants, all the animals, all the other people, and you have compassion for their situation in life, just like you have it for your own. So it's the key to actually shifting our world to one in which we nurture each other and all the animals and the plants and the planet, and actually make this life flourish in the future rather than destroying it as we are in so many ways right now.
Marjorie, the Buddha has this metric. There's this story that he was out in the forest. It's a sal tree forest with these little tiny leaves, and he goes up and he picks up this handful of leaves and he says, what do you think is more, the leaves in the forest or the leaves in my hand? And the monks say, well, the leaves in your hand are few and the leaves in the forest are many. The Buddha says, so too, everything that I realized on the night of enlightenment is like the leaves of the forest, but all I teach is the leaves in my hand. That's the Four Noble Truths, which do include, a belief for, a truth about rebirth and about other realms. But I'm curious for you, how do you decide what you'll, the whole field of parapsychology and many of the things you research, it's way outside, or some degree outside of most accepted, science. So how do you decide what you'll research or what you'll speak about?
Now, there's a humor because once again, it sounds very non-materialistically. It's what my heart wants me to do. And I laugh, you know, after that original awakening, I realized I have an intellect that has its linear way of thinking, and I have the heart, which says what it really wants to do, what it's enthusiastic about, what will fulfill it. And I go for what my heart says will fulfill it. There's that joy that comes up. And I think that's why when we're about to talk about these children with autism and their ability to appear to know exactly what's in their mother's minds, when I heard that information on those podcasts, I said, I want to help other people understand that. I want to understand it better myself. Mm-hmm. And so it was a boom. I then went to the people that were doing the podcast, Diane Hennessy Powell, asked her if I could collaborate with her to write up papers. She said yes. And here we are today. So there you go.
No, this is great. And we actually came across that podcast independently, and we're kind of astounded to find this convergence when we emailed you about what you'd like to speak about.
The telepathy tapes.
The telepathy tapes.
Yeah.
And yeah, would you tell us about, you know, we know you're going to give a talk on this in a conference in Barcelona in July. Would you just tell us about, sort of dive right in and tell us about how you came to that research?
Yeah.
Basically.
Yes. I mean, so first of all, I'm certainly intrigued by telepathy all my life. And I've read some of the research that's been done in the past by Dean and others, and it's fascinating. But the issue is with the average person like me, if you're giving them a telepathic test and you give them 4 different images, for example, that might be possible to be the ones that your partner in another room is looking at, you will be above chance. Chance would be 25%, 1 out of the 4 pictures. You might be up to 30% rather than 25% in your ability to actually determine that. But 25% versus 30% is a tiny difference. And most people say, well, that's nothing. That telepathy can't really be true. So the thing about the telepathy tapes is these children are often accurate almost 100% of the time. That is phenomenally different than 25% versus 30%. So there is, I think, one of the cruxes of the issue. And when I, like you, listened to the telepathy tape podcast, I went, wow, what is going on inside of that being? And how are they able to communicate in that way, to be so receptive to the thoughts, for example, of their mother? So that's really the start of it. And maybe just a tiny bit of background. I think I was mentioning that I didn't know anything about the telepathy tapes, but I already knew Dr. Diane Hennessy Powell, the neuropsychiatrist that was beginning to do this research she was at an AAPS meeting that we had a few years ago. And so when she invited me to be on the podcast as a normal, credible neuroscientist talking about telepathy and whether it might be possible in these children, I said, sure, that sounded great. But then I was also asked to listen to the first 3 episodes before I was being interviewed. And as I said, I'm hesitant often to spend my time listening to lots of episodes on an interview, but I decided the morning of my interview, sure, I'll go ahead. And once I started listening to the first episode, I couldn't stop. They were so compelling with what these children could do. So then I contacted Diane afterwards, after I listened to all 10 episodes, and I said, I'd love to help you start publishing the research, because she'd not published anything in the typical peer-reviewed journals that would be really helpful to get it out there. And so she said, sure. So then I was given access to all of those recorded sessions of the children having these tests that were like, about an hour long of research testing. And I was able then to go through the University of Oregon Human Subjects Committee. And I should say that is a real effort in itself, because they want everything to be confidential that you're doing, so that no child, if they didn't want their identity known, would have their identity known. And it took me, I think, about 4 months to get through human subjects approval. And then I could start looking at the data. And so that's what I want to share with you a little bit tonight, at least about one of the cases, which was the first one I did, that I have just found fascinating.
Yeah, that would be great. We would love to see that. And also, I also listened to the first, several of these podcasts and found it fascinating. I found the first one especially very intriguing. And I had since, in looking around about this and telling others, people, there have been other podcasts done, quote unquote, debunking these. And I think there's a lot of exception taken to, and some preemptive dismissal based on the whole practice of spelling, I think, which is crucial to what's going on. So could you explain what is spelling, what's going on, just maybe a little bit more background in general of what the telepathy tapes seem to be showing, and how, to what extent is the debunking a true debunking or not? Yeah.
That very good question. And having looked at the literature myself now, looking at publications, I think that it is a little bit like materialism in general, that once you get a person believing hook, line, and sinker, we might say, in a particular worldview, it's very hard to change them to open up to the data that show it otherwise. And so I think when I've read a little bit about the past, what happened is that when they were first trying to teach children many years ago how to communicate through using a letter board or a number board, which the teacher or the mother would hold up to the child and they would point at one letter or another. What seemed to happen is that sometimes the person would actually be able to influence what the child pointed at because they could move that letter board back and forth, up or down. And so if they wanted a certain answer out of the child, they could sort of help make that happen. And there seemed to have been some lawsuit or lawsuits where somebody then sued, whether it was the teacher or whoever, for saying that the child had said that, et cetera. And I think the lawsuit then was won, and that then stopped the school systems from ever wanting to use this sort of facilitated communication as they talk about it. Now, I don't know anything about those particular moments, but what I do know is what the current spelling does, and how in many ways it seems to be irrelevant what was done before, because what I'm going to show you in my case with these children is that they start out, for example, with what they call facilitated communication, which is somebody might hold their wrist or their elbow to help them actually point at a letterboard. So there's a certain amount of facilitation going on, but gradually they let go of that. And then the child is doing it totally on their own. So the three cases that I'm going to be showing in a paper that we're going to be publishing are totally pointing on their own. And the first one that I'll talk to you about tonight is actually pointing at a computer. I mean, it's his own little Macintosh computer. Nobody is touching him. So it's like, if that's the case, I don't know why we're going back there to say that this is bad, because even if they're facilitated by somebody holding them in the beginning to help them learn, then they let go of that. So that's what I know from the current research that I've read.
So Marjorie, take us through the current research.
Sure. Okay, so first of all, I just want to say a lot of people don't even know exactly what autism means. So I just want to first say a little bit about that. And so it was a term that wasn't even introduced until like 1940, in the 40s, by a man named Kanner. And it was describing children who he said had severe motor coordination problems, and also repetitive physical movements such as hand flapping. They would do a lot of hand flapping and things of that sort. And also problems with communication and other social interactions. They couldn't speak very often. And so they had difficulties then with language and learning, of course. And early studies described severe communication challenges in those kids. But then the creation of these electronic spelling devices that we were just talking about has shown that many children actually have high levels of cognitive abilities. And those ended up being masked by their coordination problems and their sensory motor deficits. So I think that's the key issue, is that it was masked because they couldn't really move and they couldn't really speak. I have a cat, by the way, that wants to be on stage, so we'll let him be on stage. So then the point was that then there were studies in the late 30s that showed that some of these kids appeared to have what I would call enhanced receptive communication or telepathic abilities. I think enhanced receptive communication sounds more scientific, and so we might end up using that. But basically, that's what then triggered other people to note that every so often you found a child that seemed to be telepathic. And so then what I did after knowing that, watching Diane Hennessy Powell and reading a few of the things that she had written about it in her book, I said, okay, can I go ahead and analyze some of your children that were on the telepathy tape. So I'm going to tell you about a first one, and it's a boy. And by the way, since it's human subjects at the University of Oregon, I can't say anything about these children that would identify them, or I would be in real trouble. So we're going to call this participant number 1. And he was diagnosed with autism when he was 1.5 years of age, after he developmentally regressed after his first year of age. And the physician that his mom went to said that he was never going to be able to speak and he would never have normal intelligence. Then, until he was 11 years of age, he was non-speaking, and he'd been to 2 schools. And at this point, he changed to a 3rd school. And at that point, they began to teach him to communicate via typing. And in that first lesson at that school, they just gave him slight support at the wrist, and he was able to type 4 lines. Now, the mother didn't think that was possible from all the doctors had said to her, so she decided that she would go to school and watch when the teacher invited her, because all the previous teachers said he didn't know any numbers and he didn't know any letters. So she watched the teacher and watched him type. And so then after she then was looking at this at home after school in the later months, she found that in fact, he was able to do this for her. And she said there was a funny exchange that they had. Basically, she was out during the day while he was at school doing various errands. And when he came home, he typed to her and said that he knew that she had been out during the day. And then, in fact, he said that he actually could know where she was. And he said, first you went to Target, and after you went to Target, you couldn't find what you wanted. And then you went to Walmart, and he told her everything she had done. And that's when she said, oh my goodness, what is going on? And so what she said is, after that point, she made the choice to presume competence in her son. And at that point, everything changed between them. And that started their journey together. And I think that's the key, presuming competence, and then doing everything you can to help them actually unfold their abilities. So then he was tested by Diane Hennessy Powell in I think it was about 2017, when he was something about 14 years of age. And he had his own computer, a computer. It was I think it was a Macintosh, an Apple. And so what they did in then 45 minutes of videos that I watched is the mother and the researchers and the cameraman were behind him. And then he was sitting at his computer keyboard at a table. And his mother was shown a sheet of paper that was pulled out of an envelope by the researcher. And she looked at 5 digits on it, for example. And the cameraman looked at it, recorded that. And then she held that in front of her eyes, and then the boy in front of her, who was turned in the other direction, then typed those numbers into his keyboard. So there we have what was really going on in this particular situation. And the issue is that this kid had some terrible motor coordination problems called dyspraxia, which means that if you try to get him to actually point at a particular key on a computer, first of all, he goes sort of like this, because he's controlling almost everything from his shoulder and his elbow. And so he misses the keys all the time. And so I could imagine that a skeptic would say, well, he's just, hitting randomly on the keyboard, and sooner or later he's going to get one of the numbers the mother was looking at, but it's not real telepathy. It's not any enhanced receptive communication. So I said, how am I going to actually show the skeptic that that's not the case? So what I did is I carefully looked at every single error that he made before he made the correct response. And then on his keyboard, what you would see is the target he was supposed to hit. So his mother was looking at a number like 156, for example. And he, instead of hitting the 1, he would hit on the keyboard the key right below it, which was a Q, or the key next to it, which was a 2. And I could show that he was always within 1 or 2 keystrokes of that key with whatever his target was. So right there, I'm showing this is not random in any way at all. And in fact, I was talking to Dean Radin, who does a lot of work on telepathy, and he said, you could actually do a statistical analysis to show the probability of this being random would be 10 to the minus whatever, the way he is so close to actually hitting his target. And the point is that even when he makes a mistake, he keeps trying to hit that target, and he will hit it in the second try or the third try, and he always gets it eventually correct. The other interesting thing for me was that one could also say, well, but how do we really know that this is any different than if he were actually typing his own thoughts into the computer? Does he also have the same errors when he's typing his own thoughts into the computer? And luckily, one of the experimenters asked him this question during the testing. He said, "How do you do what you do?" And what he typed into that computer is, "This mind knows my mom's mind." And so he typed that with errors, just like he typed before. And the errors were very, very similar in being in the key strokes close to, above, below, to the side of that first one. So that was interesting. And then the last thing that I was intrigued by was the fact that he actually can't speak, but when he's trying to say a letter, for example, for a B, he would say ba, or for an N, he would say na, or for a number, for 1, he would say wa, or 5, fa, or 6, sa. So I could hear on that video about a half a second before he pushed down on a key very abruptly what he intended to hit. And he was always saying the right letter that he intended, even when he missed the letter because he was off by 1 or 2 keys. So to me, those data say, look, he has the intention. He's seeing in his mind, and he has the intention to hit the right key. He actually says the right key's name. So in some senses, we don't even need the key when we hear what he's trying to say. So, and that was the first child. And to me, that is fascinating data. And I then looked at the other children. And so I'm just going to say briefly about the other 2 children. Interestingly, one of the questions that people ask about somebody that is autistic is whether they might be what might be called a savant. And I think we've heard about, like in Rain Man, stories of autistic savants and things like that. Some of these children actually seem to be precognitive, like they can think in it or see things in advance that are about to happen. And so at one point, Diane Hennessy Powell was intrigued with one of the children, whether she might be, or whether she might have super mathematical abilities. So in the case of the data I analyzed with her, the therapist that was actually looking at a particular mathematical equation, and the girl now was separated by a barrier, so she couldn't see the therapist, and she couldn't see what the therapist was looking at, was said, look at the image of the numbers that are in my mind for this mathematical problem, and then type them into your board, and then give the solution to the mathematical problem. And what was interesting that happened is that she literally could see what was in her therapist's mind and type in the numbers. She was about 94% accurate, not 100%, 94% accurate. And when she went to type the solution, she typed the solution that was also in the therapist's hands without doing the calculation herself. And they could tell that because one time the solution was incorrect in the therapist's hands, and she typed in the incorrect solution. So her case was simply, she's a very good mind reader of her therapist, but she doesn't have super mathematical capabilities in any way. But so all 3 of these children basically had those abilities. And when I looked at, in one case, there were something like, I think maybe 67 trials, in another case, 15 trials each that I analyzed. They were accurate between 94 and 97% of the times when I analyzed all the digits and all the letters of the words that they were looking at in their mother's or therapist's minds. And that's unbelievable, 94 to 97%.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And the implications of this, I mean, if telepathy were able to be proven, that would really upturn a lot of what, accepted science now. And I mean, you look at the Buddha's teachings, and in discourse after discourse, again and again, the Buddha would just talk about the mind's capacity for telepathy for people who've cultivated that skill. And it's not even spoken about in marvelous terms, like this person could just know the mind of another. I'm curious, in the Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, just talks about how difficult it is to break out of the gravity of a specific structural framework that we have. And I'm curious if you think that AI might be able to analyze the data and have less of the human bias, like so much of what makes a shift out of a particular scientific paradigm impossible is the human bias for what feels comfortable and known. Whereas, AI might be able to analyze the data that you're looking at and gather more data and have less of that bias. Have you started experimenting with AI? Or do you have any hopes that AI might be able to look at this particular realm of autistic children telepathy or other realms?
I think it's an interesting question, and it certainly could be the case. I wanted to mention, though, that what people have said to me when they have actually asked AI about certain questions just in terms of knowledge on the web, you have to be careful because there's so much literature out there that says things like telepathy aren't possible, that it will report that equally to anything else.
Right.
And you have to be very careful about how specifically you phrase the question to get them to truly look at the data that are relevant. Now, saying that, I think that you could be right in giving him, for example, I wouldn't even know how to do this with AI, but basically giving them the data that I have presented now from the videotapes and see what they have to say about those data. I mean, they could probably give us the probability of this being correct or being just random guessing.
Right.
Well,
Right.
I noticed that one of the people, in fact, in the chat has said, not that the videos don't sound compelling and interesting, but have they given participant one a large keyboard with keys of several square inches, for example, to bypass the motoric problems? And I should say yes. In fact, he had another type of just a flat like letterboard and number board for these particular experiments that they didn't want somebody holding it, and it was on the table, and when he would try to hit it, it would move on the table. And so in that particular setup, in that environment, it didn't work for him. If they'd had it in a solid, unmoving case, that might have worked for them. I think what I should mention is that these case studies are done in some ways ad hoc ways in people's homes with the mother, the child, the researchers, the video cameras, and they aren't made in a laboratory. And that's what's going to be our next step. So Marina Weiler, who's at the University of Virginia, Diane Hennessy Powell, and myself are working with a woman, Maria Welch, in Chicago to work with her children in her own, I guess I'd call it a school, but it's a school for these children that a speech therapist, et cetera, is Maria Welch, is helping them really make their abilities flourish. And so we'll be able to do things in a more controlled environment and have exactly the right types of equipment for them to point at, for example. So the answer is yes. And I should say, the other interesting thing, though, to understand, I am a motor control therapist by background. And so I know that if you're trying to get the optimal performance of anybody, but specifically a child, you have to consider three things: the individual and the constraints on what they can do, like their motor abilities, their attention span, hypersensitivity, all those things. You have to consider the level of the task. And is the keyboard too small, for example? What's going on there? And then the third one you have to consider is the environment they're in. And if you're in an environment with a cameraman, bright lights, people running around, trying to be quiet, but trying to direct a video, you can understand that it's going to be harder for the child. And so one thing that I'm aware of is that we need to really control those things in these children. And I think when we get those controlled, that will be important. One of the limitations on the children is most of these children do not want, or I want to say can't, but that's not quite the word. They're used to their mother being next to them when they're doing these things. And the skeptics don't want the mother anywhere in the room. The skeptics want the mother in another room because somehow they feel she could be giving them nonverbal cues with a slight movement this way or that way. And I'll give you one example. In the third child, who was 97% accurate, his mother is holding a number board in her hand like this, and he is next to her at a table, and she's turned around to see the letters that she needs to now have in her mind. And then he is pointing a pencil through the stencil at the letter or number that he's pointing at that is the right one. And I took the video frames and I showed that the video frames are hardly moving at all from one letter to the next as he's going from one to another as he's typing it. And a skeptic could say, I don't care that it's almost not moving at all. Maybe that's the slightest bit of a movement that's enough for him to know what letter is next. Now, if that's the case, that's pretty amazing right there and then. But I think those are the things that you have to think about when you are dealing with skeptics. So you really want a letterboard that is stationary, that cannot be moved. And you would like the mother not to be holding on to it. So when I was talking with my friend Dean Radin about publishing this paper, he said, what you can say is this set of experiments were modestly controlled, whereas a rigorously controlled experimental situation would have people in 2 separate rooms and all of these other things controlled for. And that will be the next set of experiments.
So Marjorie, to touch on the human element here, I'm curious first why these particular individuals have this quality of, this kind of reliability of telepathy. And more than that, did you get any kind of anecdotal reports, just what it's like for a mother and child to be connected in that way? Like, what does it mean to be bound to another's mind in that sense? How did that affect the relationship?
Definitely. I mean, so 2 things. One of the hypotheses that we have as we're going forward is that when you do not have access to conceptual reality and speech when you're young, it might be a little bit like the meditators who basically are quieting their mind completely and allowing them to have this broader perceptual ability. So it could be that is actually influencing things, because when they're young, nobody has taught them to communicate. And in fact, I mean, interestingly, they are incredibly frustrated, you can tell, because they're like acting out, they're screaming, they're running constantly because they don't have that sense even of where their own body is in space. They have all these sensory motor problems. So I think that it may be, and one of the questions will be, when they learn to communicate really, really well, will their telepathic abilities actually begin to go away? Will they feel more separate from the rest of the world? I don't know. I think that will be an interesting question, however. And I should say that it's not every child that has these abilities. And I think it'll be interesting to see what percent actually are capable of communicating and then showing that they have this enhanced receptive communication.
And in terms of the relationship between the children and their mothers, would you speak to that briefly?
Oh, yes, definitely. Yes. So first of all, yes, it's typically with the mother, but not necessarily only with the mother. They can be that way with the father and or with a therapist. So it's not that it's only limited, but I think there's probably something about that nurturing that goes on between child and mother. And what the mothers say is, first of all, they are taught in our society to believe that telepathy doesn't exist. But then the child proves that it does, because the mother cannot hide Christmas presents. The child knows exactly where the Christmas presents are hidden. And often they know what's in the Christmas present because they knew what the mother was buying. So the mother has a hard time hiding cookies from them. They don't want them to eat cookies. So there are all of those things that happen. So they say that it can be challenging. And I think, one of the therapists actually said about working with her children in the therapy setting is that she really said, it's not polite to read my mind. I need to have some privacy. So I think that's another interesting thing, whether one then can actually help the children to see that at times that's appropriate and other times it's not. And you're reminding me that in my own spiritual tradition, it was clear that my own teacher, it was Swami Muktananda, was able to actually know what certain thoughts were in other people's minds. And somebody said, well, do you have the ability to read my mind? And he said, why would I want to read your mind? It's like, I don't want to read everybody's garbage. But I think maybe the point is that if one is connected with everybody in the world, there will be times when it is helpful and that information comes into you unrequested in a certain sense. And then you can deal with that and act on it in the right way. But it's not like you're trying to read everybody's mind. It's not a thing that we would want to do.
Thank you.
Marjorie, I heard you speak on another podcast about just the course of history. In the distant past, there was kind of an age of enchantment that there's, myth is very strong. And then there came, the scientific revolution and modern science, and it became an age of disenchantment. And now there's kind of a period of re-enchantment. And I mean, when you talk about just following your own heart and the power of that, or when I think about my own teachers who, have really extremely bright minds and who just don't seem to have any qualms at all about believing in rebirth or all these things, realms which seem beyond what I can see. I'm curious how one can make sure that in re-enchanting oneself or in leaning into these realms, which the Buddha said do exist, how does one make sure in this process of re-enchantment is becoming re-enchanted with true things? The Buddha said that he would teach things which are both true and beneficial. He wouldn't teach anything which was beneficial but not true. So how do you just judge for yourself, or how do you recommend others might judge that something is both true and beneficial?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I actually began to understand that better when I read a wonderful book by Bernardo Kastrup, Kastrup, who is an idealist philosopher, which would be meaning consciousness is fundamental. And he had written earlier books that were very analytic. And in fact, he calls the idealism he believes in analytic idealism. It was very rational and linear. And I liked what he had to say. But then he wrote another book called More Than Allegory. And it's about beliefs and how they point us to reality, and how actually everybody in this world is living in a myth, and we believe in myths because you cannot know reality. Just realizing that is a fundamental doctrine. The scientific worldview is a myth. Along with all Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, they are all myths because they are our attempts to point at something that is beyond what our intellect and our concepts can really understand. And so what we're doing is we're trying to take the best myth that is most beneficial for us in helping us understand, pointing toward that reality that is the truth that cannot be known. And I like that, because then I say, okay, well, how efficient is materialism? Well, in technology, it's very efficient. But in terms of saving the planet and interacting with other people, it is terrible. And so, okay, then we'll take materialism and those aspects can be used in certain ways. But then we will go to all these other myths, which really are showing us more clearly what they are truly pointing to in the way of consciousness. And I give you one example of many of these myths, which I love. They say that according to some of these, these might be these what would we call them, pre-science myths, where a god decides that the god wants to create this beautiful reality, and it's a dream, and the god is really enjoying that reality, but then the god gets so enamored with it that he steps into his own dream, and boom, here we are, that god that stepped into our own dream, and now we've forgotten that we're really that being that is non-embodied, etc., that just created this for our own enjoyment and our own learning. And I think that's how I feel about it right now. It's like, okay, I will look at all the different myths and I will find the ones that feel more resonant to me in terms of explaining this time, space, gravity continuum that I'm in, and make my judgments in that way. It's not that I'm throwing out materialism, but it's like I'm adding to it in terms of making a myth that's much bigger than that.
Marjorie, I'm wanting to draw out in terms of how this relates to all of our spiritual practice. We talked about that meaning of the primacy of consciousness and how that can affect our view in our hearts and our connection to others, as well as our kind of feeling or perception of the end of life. And this for me is the unifying thread between this and our practice and our view of the world. And I think perhaps to kind of bring up and really emphasize that shared thread, I'd like to ask you about a related field of study, which you've also been going into. We don't have too long, but I wondered if you would speak about end-of-life lucidity and, perhaps just what you've been looking into there. Because I feel like in that study on the primacy or power of consciousness in and of itself, we begin to feel even more powerfully how this can actually influence our heart's orientation towards life and why this is a meaningful discussion for practitioners.
Sure. And so just so people understand, terminal lucidity was actually not even coined as that term until 2009, when Bruce Grayson, who we know was one of the big people doing near-death experiences, and Michael Naum wrote their first paper talking about terminal lucidity. Before, it had been lumped into all end-of-life experiences. And this is what it is. It is when a person who is mentally impaired at the end of their life, for example, by dementia, or they're in a coma, or they have terminal cancer, experiences enhanced mental clarity just before they die. And it might also be that they have their physical abilities, including sitting or speaking or eating, come back to them in those last moments, and then they die. And it's seen in many different diagnoses, but Alzheimer's and dementia are the biggest ones where it's most clear. And so we were interested in it because it can't be explained according to the materialist perspective. Basically, these people have progressive diseases like Alzheimer's, where the brain is full of holes. In fact, if you look at a brain scan, you see that the cells have died in the brain. And that's why the scientists would say, well, clearly they are confused. They're not oriented in space or time. They don't know people anymore because of the look of the pathology in the brain. But the issue is that then, in those last minutes to hours of life, even with that brain, they come back to total lucidity and they say goodbye to their loved ones, and that can't be explained. So just briefly, my team, which includes, in fact, Bruce Grayson, Michael Naum, and others, created a questionnaire that we would give to healthcare workers and to family members to say, have you witnessed terminal lucidity in anyone? And will you answer these like 45 questions so that you can tell us what you know about that particular situation that will help us understand terminal lucidity. And so, I mean, the things that we began to find is that, first of all, most of these cases had a duration of about 10 minutes or less. Some were longer, some were up to a day. And the vast majority of people died within 24 hours after that terminal lucidity episode. And maybe I'll just give you a quick example of one.
Please.
And that'll help you understand. So it's an example told by a nurse. And it's of an episode of a few minutes of lucidity in a 63-year-old man within 2 hours of his passing. And it exemplifies going from that severe mental impairment, not oriented in time and space, to amazing clarity. So this is what she says. She says, a 63-year-old patient with an advanced brain tumor was unable to communicate for 2 weeks and wasn't oriented in time, space, or person. His condition deteriorated visibly, and death seemed to be near. At night, he was restless, and his breathing was irregular. I sat down at his bedside, and I held his hand, which he refused to let go of. His breathing became shallower, and he seemed more relaxed. Unexpectedly, he opened his eyes, and he looked at me, and he maintained eye contact. Then he addressed me by name and said, I thank you for being here. I thank you in general for everything you have done for me, and especially I thank you for your accompanying me in dying. She said, I was completely surprised by his sudden clarity. I was amazed that he knew my name, and even more surprised by his choice of words. She said, I never used this term, as it did not seem possible for us to accompany patients in dying. So not only was the patient's sudden clarity, but also his choice of words remarkable. About 2 hours later, the patient passed away very quietly. So that gives you one sense of what it's like. Now, if you want to end there, we can, or I can tell you a few more stories.
I'm curious. I mean, terminal lucidity, it sounds great. I would love to have it, at the time of death. And I'm curious if, in doing all these studies, if you've found any conditions, like any life practices is there any like through line of the people who have these terminally lucid moments? Like, are there any habits that they had, or is there any way to predict who might have terminal lucidity and not? And if not, would just love to hear a few more stories as well. But
so the first thing is that, in fact, if I had 45 minutes to talk to you, I would be saying at the end that I think that one of the key factors is how people die. If they're allowed to die at home or in a hospice setting that is surrounded by the family, there's a lot more likelihood that terminal lucidity will occur. If they are in an intensive care unit or rushed to the hospital, there is so much chaos around them that it probably is not going to happen. And people won't even be willing to listen and be aware of their becoming lucid. So I think for me, it's a shift in the healthcare system where we accept dying as a natural process. And then we make sure that those last days, hours, minutes of dying are in a very sacred setting where the person can actually be able to communicate with their family. I should mention that many MDs have said they haven't noticed terminal lucidity because they only come in to check, for a few brief moments about how the person is doing. It's the social worker, the family, the nurse who's there with the patient who actually witnesses these things. So there's one brief part of the answer.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, please do. I mean, we'll have to jump over to Zoom in a second. Yep. And for those who put questions in the chat, we'll get to those on Zoom. I'm sorry. But Marjorie, would you tell us another one or two stories? That would be a lot.
Yeah, this one is amazing because some of the people actually increase their appetite and their capacity to eat and drink and move in those last hours. So here's one other example from a nurse. She said, the lady I remember most vividly had been unresponsive for days and was considered to be in the terminal phase of life. I came in one morning expecting that she had died overnight and found her sitting up eating breakfast. She was happily chatting with her family, who were a bit stunned, to say the least. As I was aware that this might be a case of terminal lucidity, I explained to the family that her bright condition might not last, and she died that night. And I'll give you one other example because this is actually even, I think, more amazing to me, and it's of again, increase in appetite, clarity, emotions in a 75-year-old woman who was dying, and it was witnessed by an MD. So in this case, the doctor says, I was called by a GP to advise on the end-of-life care of a lady dying at home from metastatic bowel cancer. And on my visit, she was drowsy and unable to swallow. An infusion of morphine and a sedative were commenced, and on follow-up 24 hours later, she was unresponsive and seemingly pain-free. Knowing that she was close to death, I phoned the family each morning to check on her progress. The following 2 days, the family reported that their mother was unconscious and seemingly comfortable. She had not stirred even when an indwelling catheter was inserted during this time. On day 3, the daughter reported that her mother was out of bed and sipping champagne. Sipping champagne. She then went on to say that it's her mother's birthday, and when the family had informed her of that, she opened her eyes, and upon hearing the family had gathered at her home, she asked to be helped to the kitchen, where she sat with them and celebrated her birthday. She returned to bed shortly after, went to sleep, and did not regain consciousness, and she died within 24 hours of that experience. So, I mean, those are the examples. You go, wow.
Marjorie, it's, I think, no small thing to have taken the leap from the academic environments where you grew up and the worldview's prominent there to really like looking into these other areas and in a joyful way and a rigorous way. And I do think it's important in the world today. And I just want to thank you for kind of having the courage to do that and having the willingness to talk to us and just your general joy. It's really a pleasure to actually talk to you. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And we'll post the Zoom link into the chat for those who want to join and ask a few more questions. Marjorie will be joining us on Zoom. And otherwise, we'll see many of you next week on a Wednesday. Marjorie, take care. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.